Welcome to Humanity Rising. I'm Tom Eddington. Jim Garrison is traveling this week and will not be able to join us today. Delighted to have our series this week on forgiveness. We've been exploring forgiveness over the last 3 days, and today's focus is going to be on the law. And the interesting thing about America is we're a legal and a laws-based society. And there are so many benefits that we have as a result of that. Stability, predictability, companies want to do business, quote unquote, with America because of our legal system. Certainly affluent and wealthy governments and people around the world, they park their money here because of our legal system. And we have all benefited from that in many, many ways. And yet at the same time, that legal framework, that legal system, while providing stability, has also exacted a real cost and a real price. We have a very litigious society. We graduate hundreds of thousands of lawyers every year through our law schools. And as a result, we were under the oppressive burden of our legal system. And as a result, conversations like the one we're having this week about forgiveness have had a really hard time finding their way into our society, into our legal system. We've talked this week about arbitration, we've talked about mediation, and we've talked about the movement for more forgiveness and the benefits that help us, because as human beings, whenever we do encounter conflict, the law can only address certain aspects of it. It doesn't speak to the emotional, the personal, the relational. And that's the work of forgiveness. So delighted to have my good friend and colleague, Eileen Barker, with us again today. Welcome, Eileen, and looking forward to this conversation in particular on forgiveness and the law.
I am too. I feel like it's a really beautiful sort of overlapping of interests of mine and a really important one for all the reasons that you said. The other thing about the legal system that I think is really significant is that when we use the legal system, it is a coercive system, and sometimes we need that. And when we need it, it's really important that we have it. And the fact that we have it in a structured, rule-based way is not to be taken for granted because it was not always like that, obviously. And so it is really important. At the same time, we lose a lot when we have to force somebody, when we have to be forced. A lot is lost in that. And so I think the things we'll be talking about today, in the area of, in the direction of forgiveness, but also how, continuing on the conversation with Ken Cloak yesterday and all of our speakers up until now, but how do we move forward as we transition, as we grow, as as human beings, so that we don't have to be forced. And there's some, what else is available besides being forced to do what's right or what we need to do. So thank you again, Tom, and Humanity Rising. And I know that there's so many people that make this possible behind you that we don't see. I want to thank each and every one of them. And also acknowledge that, I'm hearing over the week about friends and colleagues and people who are here that I'm not aware of unless they tell me, because I'm not really able to track the chat in real time because I really want to be focused and present to the conversation. So really great to be here. And shall we bring Kim in?
Yeah, it'd be great to bring a real pioneer in the world of the law and forgiveness. So welcome, Kim. Absolutely delighted to have you with us today. And I was introduced to you by Eileen a number of years ago, and I know how special and close the relationship you have, and how you've been such a guide and support to Eileen and her work. So just delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me. Well, Eileen has inspired me along the way as well. So it's good to see you again, Tom.
Well, let's dive right in. I'd love for you to share with our audience a bit about the journey you've been on and how it is you've gotten to where you are and what inspires you to keep going.
That's we have not enough time for all of that, but I'll start. I went to law school a little later. I had already I had a blended family of 7 children, and I graduated in 1989. And by that time, I had encountered the adversarial system often enough that I decided that lawyers were jerks and I didn't want to be one. And so I did things like I ran a domestic violence program. I did good work in the world. And then about 1993, I was in a landmark education program, and a guy named Forrest Baird stood up and he started talking about how he practiced law. And I described that as the day that everything went from black and white to color.
Mm,
Like one of the movies you see, the cartoons where everything's dull and then all of a sudden the butterflies are flying. Forrest talked about practicing law in a way that made sure that he was a divorce lawyer, that he made sure that his clients were friends with their ex at the end of the divorce, because he said they needed to raise their kids together. And they
mm,
needed to, still have common friends and all of that kind of stuff. And so he talked about things like dignity and healing and peacemaking and forgiveness. And, it's like I'd never heard a lawyer talk like that. And so I knew immediately that was my path. And since that time, I've been working on what I call a new paradigm of law. And I still practice. I collected lawyers. I've written 3 books for the American Bar Association, Lawyers as Peacemakers, Lawyers as Changemakers, and Trauma-Informed Law. So, I'm not the lawyer you watch on TV. So I'll stop there and we can let the rest of it unfold.
Well, thank you for your work. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, you talk about the impact that Forrest had on you, and I'm listening to you share, what you've written and what you've been up to, and I'm just noticing in my own body, I'm having that reaction that I assume you had when you heard Forrest. You're using language that, we don't hear attorneys typically use.
Well, and as you were just before I came on, you were talking about the impact of the law. The law is like the DNA. It's the structure that we live in. Most of it's invisible. You walk down the street and you're surrounded by buildings that have been built by code, so they're not falling apart on you. You drive on either the right or the left side of the road because that's what the traffic laws say. You are married or not married because the law has declared it so. And so it permeates our lives. And when you are in a legal system that denies connection, denies emotion, encourages separation, that's a big impact on society.
Hmm. And yet we somehow have allowed that culture to be sustained. I didn't go to law school, but I can imagine most lawyers, when there are people who are students of the law, they're not getting opportunities to take classes on forgiveness or compassion or communication or the humanistic aspects of what it means to be a fully functioning human in our society.
Well, and that's actually a great way of looking at it. There have been some studies in California, Hastings and Berkeley. What I heard about it, and I'm not sure if this is the case, but I heard they were trying to figure out who to admit. And so they did a survey on successful lawyers and what kinds of folks they are. And in doing that, they found out that the skills of a lawyer are not generally the skills that were at that time being taught in law school. Like we teach people to think like a lawyer, to be analytical, to put emotion aside. And most of the skills that are needed to be a lawyer are those human skills. They used to call them soft skills, but lawyers don't like anything soft. So sometimes we call them core or essential skills. And so that's the That's a shift that is happening in legal education. It's not universal. And in fact, I run into law professors all the time who say that's just a waste of time. And like it's really about the precedent and the law. And, precedent is always looking back. And part of what is happening in the integrative law movement is we're starting to look forward, starting to look at how can law shape us into the future, because the future is like happening right now. Law tends to be one of the slowest professions to change, and that's actually a good thing in some ways, because you want that kind of stability. You don't want tomorrow morning somebody gets up and says, "Now we're going to drive on the other side of the road." You can't get married anymore, or those sorts of things. Those are things that people count on, and there's a certain stability in that. So we want the law to provide some stability, but we also want it to be flexible enough to change.
Yeah, I want to explore that a bit later in our conversation, but just to finish this thread for a moment, a very dear friend and mentor of mine died a couple of years ago at age 90, and he had been trained in law and had practiced law throughout his life and was still practicing law in his late 80s. And he shared with me that he had a brilliant mind and just could really understand problems and knew how to address them. But he felt like he had spent much of the last couple of decades of his life trying to unlearn the damage he had gotten from law school.
Yeah, and luckily we're now able to prevent some of that damage in some classes. So some of the clinical classes are great for that, but yeah, it's not a complete shift yet.
Well,
Well,
let's dig deeper into that conversation. Sorry, Eileen, I didn't mean to cut you off.
it's okay. I just wanted to say that those aspects of legal education, legal practice are very detrimental to the lawyers themselves. And many studies have shown now for, I don't know how, at least 20 years that I'm aware of, probably longer, that lawyers have, very high rates of depression, divorce, substance abuse, and suicide. And so a certain amount of attention has been going to address that. Not enough, but I really have to think it's because when you dehumanize, when you say no, emotions don't count, when you do all these things that have been historically done to train lawyers, and I, by the way, taught at both of those law schools, Berkeley and Hastings, it takes a toll. It's very damaging to us. And so I think that is a really important indicator right there, that is not sustainable for lawyers or the people that we serve. Yeah.
So I kind of want to talk about the trauma that holds the legal system together, but I want to make sure that Tom gets to go in the direction he wants to go as well.
Well, let's go there.
So, so back during the pandemic, I had been traveling as a digital nomad for altogether 15 years, and I got kind of stuck in one place. And a friend of mine called me up and said, "I'm working on my master's degree in social work to add to my law degree, but I can't find a book on trauma-informed law." And so I said, "Okay, well, I can't find one either. Maybe we should write one." And because I had two other ABA books, I reached out to the ABA and I put together a team that included some trauma experts, and my background in restorative justice and domestic violence and all of that qualified me in a way that was not book learning, but life learning. And so we started editing this book on trauma-informed law. And then we had the pandemic, and we had Black Lives Matter, and we had the graves being uncovered at the schools in Canada, and it was like trauma after trauma after trauma, and so we got to live in the trauma of what was going on in the world while we were writing this book. And my conclusion from that was looking at the legal system is that trauma is the glue that holds it together. And all of our training as lawyers to be analytical and to push all that aside is part of the problem. It's that dehumanizing process that, somebody comes to you. If somebody walked in the door and said, I've just had a car accident, you'd get them some water, you'd make sure they were okay. But if they've had a death in the family, by murder, or they've had, something terrible happen to them, but they walk in the door the next day, we don't treat them like they're traumatized. And in fact, if they start trying to tell the story, which is a really common trauma experience, we tell them, oh, well, we want to, kind of not tell that story that way. And so a lot of my restorative justice work was about just listening to people tell their stories. And that's not what happens in most law offices. But we, as lawyers, we're taught that the emotion doesn't matter. And then we cut ourselves off. And then we go home and we flip that switch. And the judges hear traumatic event after traumatic event, day after day, they get numb. And so the trauma is what brings people to court. And yet we are not trained to address it. And we're worse than that. We're trained to ignore it and discount it. And so that dehumanizing system has repercussions way, way beyond just one incident.
I want to say that first of all, the lawyers and judges, they don't have the training to hold all of that emotion. So it does quickly, we would never use these words, but I'm going to use, lawyers would never say it's too overwhelming. It's just too much for me. We just say it's not relevant. And we need to focus here. We have a way of saying that, and even the way we think of it. We don't, we're not vulnerable about it. We're not to say, wow, this is really painful. I don't know what to do with this. I've never heard anything like this. But we have professional ways to respond, and that really cut that off. And then the other thing I have seen is how the legal system is re-traumatizing. First, because of cutting off just not giving people space for them to be where they are and have the support they need, but also being in an adversarial process. And unfortunately, I've even seen that when it comes to mediation, because that is often where people are actually confronting each other now. It's not really in court. Cases don't really go to trial. They confront, even if they're in separate rooms, which is common, and they don't see each other, they know the other person is in the other room or on the other side of a Zoom call, and the mediator is putting pressure on them. So it's re-traumatizing. And that's where I think we, as professionals, really have to take a look. One other thing I wanted to mention in this conversation about legal training, because it's a really important issue for me, is another very important study, more than one, but series of studies showed that when people enter law school, they are the same as the general population. Normal. By the end of the first year, so law school is typically 3 years. By the end of the first year, they have Kim might know the numbers, but a marked degree of depression, and their mental health never, really fully recovers until they do something like what Kim's talking about.
I think it's something like a third are clinically depressed, and by the end of the second year, which is when interviews happen, by the way, the number is even higher.
So
That's
that's
extraordinary.
Mhm.
So I want to just shift the conversation slightly. In certain parts of the country here in the U.S., there's been a recognition of a need to change things. So we see something like a collaborative divorce process where you have trained professional therapists as part of the team supporting the attorneys and the parties going through a divorce process. Could you speak to that, and also where that's being done in other areas of the law, if it is?
That's also another big question. So collaborative law was created by Stu Webb in Minneapolis. He's in his 90s now. And he saw the things that we've been talking about. He saw the damage that was being done to the children and the clients from the adversarial system. And then he also saw that he lost a friendship with another lawyer because of a case. And he just said, I'm not going to do this anymore. And this was 1991. He wrote a letter to the judge, says, I'm not going to do this anymore. From there, a lot of things have happened, including that Forrest Baird, who I mentioned earlier, was a trained collaborative lawyer. And so it was about that time I met Stu, and I started doing collaborative law in North Carolina. But now there are probably about 50,000 lawyers, is my guesstimate. Many years ago, they counted them and there were 30,000. And nobody's asked me how many I've trained since then. And so I kind of, extrapolated at least 50,000 lawyers around the world. Many countries are doing this process that can be two lawyers working with their clients. It can be a team process, and that's sort of the industry standard is to have like a divorce coach, a child specialist, a financial specialist, neutrals that are helping the people make decisions rather than having warring experts come in and say, well, I think it ought to be this way and I think it ought to be this way. It's like, no, we're not going to fight about that. We're actually going to use all of our problem solving skills to resolve it. Now, the key in collaborative practice, which is now what it's called, is that you sign a contract saying that if you don't resolve it, you have to start all over. So, all of the materials you've gotten together, don't get admitted in court. You have to go and start over with new lawyers because the collaborative lawyers will not go to court. So in my case, for example, I haven't been to court since 1999. They send me things about, how they're going online and e-court and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, I don't have to pay attention to that anymore.
Congratulations.
So collaborative law, it was about the same time actually as restorative justice started happening. And so there are lots of places that restorative justice emerged. I think it's Elizabeth Gilbert in one of her recent books talks about ideas that just live up here and people grab them and apply them. And this movement has occurred like that. So I think the first story I heard about restorative justice in the court system happened actually in the 70s. And it was a bunch of boys in Ontario who went out and trashed a neighborhood, and they were good boys, and the judge said, well, we don't want to just send these kids to jail, and they did a restorative process where they brought everybody together, and then the boys cleaned up the neighborhood and repaired the relationships, and so that started getting into the courts. And in the early 2000s, I think it was, maybe in the 90s somewhere, there were over 1,000 restorative justice programs when they did a survey. Some of those lost funding in certain administrations, and then others have sprung up since then. So I'm not sure what the number is now, but maybe 1,000 of them in North America. And then of course, the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa is a restorative justice process as well. So if you look up restorative justice in any country, you're going to find restorative justice programs in the country. I can go on there. Therapeutic jurisprudence began when a couple of law professors were both writing, and they realized they were writing about the same kinds of topics, and they were looking at, could law be healing, or did it always have to be punitive? And so they were looking at, there could be a therapeutic approach or an anti-therapeutic approach. And that's now built up into a worldwide movement of mostly scholars who I just was at a conference in Barcelona in July, and there were hundreds of people from around the world who came, and they were all talking about it. It was the International Academy of Law and Mental Health. And they were talking about all these therapeutic jurisprudence approaches. My favorite of the therapeutic jurisprudence, or TJ approaches, is the problem-solving court model. And that is, it emerged in drug cases where people were committing crimes because they were under the influence. And the root problem was not the crime, it was the drug problem. So instead of just putting people in jail and then they come out and they return to their drug problem, it's this revolving door. They started having a therapeutic court where, instead of being the punitive kind of all-powerful judge, the judges were trained to work with them in a more partnership style. Excuse me. And so the judges were, like often like in plain clothes, not on a high bench, and it was more of a case management. And they became, I call it sometimes, more parental in their encouragement. So the person who had committed the crime comes into court and they are actually supported in getting clean. They're put into drug programs, and they're also they are not incarcerated. Different programs have different rules, but some of them are, you will be like have your cases dropped if you complete the drug program. So they come into court like weekly or monthly, report how they're doing. They have case managers, social workers who help them get their life in order, get their GED, go back to school, get a place to live, get a job. And so they are completely kind of have wraparound services so that they get clean and sober, and people don't have to go into the jail. So a lot of this began in Miami. They said that Miami jail was the biggest drug treatment program in the world.
Wow.
At that point. And so they, it was like, let's do something different. And so that grew until there are thousands of drug courts around the world. They've moved into things like domestic violence, child support. So it's like in child support, I really love this one. Instead of just making the other parent pay, they actually encourage creating a relationship, so that the desire to support the child comes from loving the child, not from the adversarial relationship with the other parent.
So with these programs that you and Eileen have mentioned, are they still on the cutting edge, or would you say that they're becoming normalized or becoming mainstream?
I really wish I could say they're mainstream. I think they're still cutting edge, even with like thousands of the drug courts, tens of thousands of collaborative lawyers. Most law schools still do not teach those things. And so the students find out about them when they get into the real world. And then most people have not heard about them. There hasn't been like a big television show, although Oprah did a bunch on restorative justice when she had her show. But there hasn't been this big media event or anything that people expect this. But they're growing, and they're established. They're not going to go away very easily or quickly. One of my dear friends who passed away during the pandemic, Peggy Hora, did a study on judicial satisfaction and found that the judges who do these courts actually have more hope. And they're happier with their jobs. They're healthier. They have less depression.
And
so everybody gets helped.
Where's the resistance? What's stopping this from becoming mainstream?
I think there's still an old eye for an eye, punitive consciousness among a lot of people. Yeah, a lot of Ubiquity people are probably spiral dynamics oriented, and I am. And so I look at sort of the levels of values and the environmental causes. We don't have a lot of people who are in second tier, and this really appeals to the people who are second tier or green.
Speaking to that also, I first want to mention there's hopeful signs. Another one with restorative justice is what's happening in my area with San Quentin Prison here in Marin County, California, which has always been, a traditional prison. The sort of notable thing about it was that's where it housed death row. That's what it's really probably most known for. But in the last year, um, Governor Gavin Newsom has, I don't know if he's mandated or legislated or how it's coming about, but San Quentin is now being rededicated to be a home of restorative practices akin to what's being called the Norway model, where where the focus is really on rehabilitation. And so I think that there are really important steps being taken forward. And eventually, and it takes time. I like your point, Kim, about law being a slow moving, slow to change institution, and that's good. That's what I think about in a lot of areas I actually think, and I won't digress into this, but just to make the analogy, like the political divide we see in our country, in the United States and across the world to some extent, it's an issue of slow to change and quick to change. And some of the slowness is good because it creates stability, and some of the quickness is good because it creates innovation and solution. And if we can honor those both, we find something, I think, really optimal. But back to this, I see it in mediation. Mediation was sort of on the cutting edge, and then it was brought in to the legal field 30 years ago. It's now, you'd have to say, mainstream because most cases go to mediation. But in bringing mediation into the legal field, because of the influence of the legal system, mediation has become somewhat adversarial, sometimes very adversarial. So it's sort of both and. Now, why is that happening? I think it goes back to legal education. I think people do what they're trained to do and what they're competent to do. When I taught law students, I taught classes on negotiation and mediation, and I definitely seeded all of these, talked about apology and forgiveness and all of these things, and a whole different value system. My students would say things like this: I love this. This is what I want to do. But I have $90,000 of loans to repay. Now it's probably 200 or 300,000. That was a while back, but I have to get a job and I have to, the market is not supporting it. So I think it's a multi-party issue in the marketplace and what businesses are looking for and clients want. It's what lawyers are trained to do because we stay in our comfort zone. And then, the innovators bring in the new ideas. And that's where we're at, as far as I see.
Well, um, it is partly about the comfort zone for sure, because we are not trained. First of all, we're not trained in conflict. Law school does not train you in any of the dynamics of conflict, does not have any, well, I'm speaking historically because this is changing. And in fact, Eileen has taught, I have taught, but over the mainstream. And lawyers get really into this groove of, oh, the rules are going to protect me. I wrote an article one time called "Litigation is for Wimps." And like if you're going to litigation, there are very strict rules. And we take a lot of courses on what those rules of evidence are and procedures and all that kind of stuff. You walk through an x-ray machine, to make sure that you don't have weapons. There's a bailiff in the courtroom that's going to keep order. The judge is there, the other lawyers are there, and you're doing you're following the rules piece. And if somebody cries, we just kind of take a break, or, nudge them in another direction. If you're in a mediation, it's messy. People cry, they snot on your table, they don't come through an X-ray machine to get into your office for the most part. You're having the real life conflict right there, and you're the one who's supposed to be putting in some structure and all that kind of stuff, and we are not trained for that. Like the other part that we are trained about is much more comfortable. And so, this whole idea of having to deal with the human piece of it is not in our training anywhere, or it is, like maybe one or two classes in law school.
Well, I don't know if there's much, well, there's a negotiation, but there's nothing on, for example, emotional intelligence. Nothing. And
There
yet,
is now. It's growing.
all right. I mean, there was when I taught too, but one adjunct professor out of all the
Right.
law schools and very little on dealing with emotions, and yet conflict is nothing if it's not emotional, and it is. Yet we're not trained for that at all. Man, dealing with de-escalating, all of the skills that go into that. So that would definitely be one of my as I sit here, takeaways going forward is as far as what's needed is a lot of opening in the legal education so it's not so out of balance in the direction of rules and laws and procedures, which are important. That is part of it, but balancing it with how you support the people going through it.
Well, and for about the last 5 years, I've focused a lot on legal education. So I definitely see that as a path because I've been teaching at Quinnipiac. They actually have the whole lawyer and the whole client as sort of a theme in their courses. And so they're in Connecticut. I teach online. And so that's a big thing. I've been writing law review articles. Integrative law is taught at 7 law schools in South Africa, and I wrote a chapter for another law school's book on teaching integrative law. So, there's a lot of this going on. There's and Eileen knows these folks in the Netherlands. They did a joint course with the design school and the law school, and they designed a courthouse based on compassion. And so there's these amazing projects going on. And the Larry Krieger started a listserv back in around 1999, as far as I can tell, called Humanizing Legal Education. And over the years, that grew. And they actually have created, there's an American Academy of Law Schools, which is 200 law schools in the United States, that has a section on, they call it balance in legal education. So it's some of the well-being stuff, which is also part of the integrative law movement, is taking care of our well-being. But then also these kinds of issues of of emotional intelligence and things like that. And so in that balanced group, every law school is represented with at least one person who is learning to do things this way and in teaching that way. So when I talk about legal education, in some ways I'm talking about a historical perspective, but it's still the mainstream. I still have those conversations with law professors who think everything I'm doing is bunk. And I'm just, I'm ruining legal education by bringing in these topics because it's about thinking like a lawyer. It's the old Kingsfield, 1L. We're going to learn to think like lawyers.
The Paper Chase, which was a film, in the 70s about law. It was very good. Yeah.
It was so true about how law school was, the book was called 1L, and it was about the first year at Harvard Law School, I think was where it actually was.
Yeah.
And people would go out in the hallway and scream, and it, that was actually both an example of how stressful it was and sort of a failure of you weren't able to put it to keep it together enough that you could suffer in silence.
Well, can you
talk about what you just said? Excuse me, Tom. So now when you talk about that atmosphere where lawyers are telling you, well, this is all a bunch of bunk, and you're ruining it. Now we get to this topic, a topic like forgiveness, and how lawyers respond to that, and the idea that love is important, and healing and forgiveness, and moving sort of in that direction. I consider it sort of not as sort of as a black and white, but as a directional.
It's directional. So we actually had a conversation in a American Bar Association dispute resolution session, Eileen and I, about what if that was actually part of the legal system. Like, that's the other thing, is that the structure of the legal system doesn't have forgiveness. It doesn't have like support for your emotional life when you're going through it. Even though we know it's a big part of it, there's no like trauma awareness. They don't train the jury in how to protect themselves if in a jury trial. Like these are not yet pieces of the legal system, and yet they are pieces. They're just the sort of I don't want to call it the shadow. It's definitely not been integrated into what's really going on.
I'd love to pick up on that thread. You've mentioned integrated law on a couple of occasions. So if you could define it and talk a bit more about what you're including in integrative law.
Can I think this is a good place to share my screen,
Sure.
because let's see if I can get this. All of these things could be considered integrative law. So I want to show the slide rather than actually listing them all. And what happened, the history is of the name, is that when I wrote Lawyers as Peacemakers, I actually refused to name the movement, because there was a lot of the restorative justice people said, well, we really think it ought to be called restorative law. And there was actually a meeting at a TJ conference of a lot of leaders who were doing different things, transformative mediation and therapeutic jurisprudence and holistic law, and my colleague Susan Dykoff, who called it comprehensive law, was also there, and people were saying, well, we need one umbrella term, and they and it didn't happen. Let me just say it didn't happen. There was a lot of conversation back and forth. So when I wrote Lawyers as Peacemakers, I actually put a paragraph in about that. I'm not going to name this thing. I just see there's a movement happening here, and it includes collaborative law and restorative justice and therapeutic jurisprudence and all of these different things. And then I was at after I wrote the book, we called together, I called it a summit of about 30 people who were leaders, and leaders from that perspective of not being ego driven. Like they might not be the founder, but they were the leader in an area. And I brought them together, and we spent the first day just talking about that. We did a conversation cafe about what are your values, what's important to you, those sorts of things. And the next morning they said, we're all doing the same thing and we need to name it. And I actually, my first reaction was, no, I don't want to spend the entire weekend on a name. And in 5 minutes, they came up with integrative law. And they were looking at the integrative medicine movement as part of that. Like why integrative? But we started thinking about it in other ways. Like, what are we integrating? We're integrating sort of the ancient knowledge, things like mindfulness and peacemaking circles and things like that are now being brought into the modern world, and things like neuroscience are showing why those things worked. And we're and sort of the masculine energy and the feminine energy. Law has been very much in the masculine energy, and now we're adding feminine energy. And in fact, we are adding, more than 50% of law students now are women, and so we're bringing that. We're bringing sort of the, uh, I've lost my train of thought here. Like sort of a systems piece and an individual piece together. Because there's us as individuals in the system, and then there's the system, and so there are all these things that we are integrating into one. And so, I have liked the name since we came up with it in 2010. And have been the person who has sort of been beating the drum of this is what it is. And so as I traveled around the world from 2008 to 2023, I met lawyers who were coming from this place. And, like those ideas that I talked about. I probably have met 15 people who believe they invented holistic law, and I believe they did. They didn't have any outside influence. They just got up one day and said, law can be practiced differently. And so there was in the 90s and up into the 2000s, an international alliance of holistic lawyers. And I met Stu Webb there. I met David Wexler and Bruce Winnick there, who are the leaders of these different movements. And so it was sort of like our home base for a little while, but holistic law had a connotation that didn't appeal to a lot of other people. So the integrative law movement was born, and holistic law is sort of encompassed in that.
And when I look at the words on this document, much of it I would expect to be there. Some of the things that really jump out at me are humor and heart and love and spiritual and multisensory. And I'm wondering, how did those find their way into the integrative law framework, and how do they show up? What does it actually mean?
So each one has a story. So the multisensory law, there's a professor, or she wasn't a teaching professor, she was a research professor in Zurich, who was studying, again, like she was not part of the sort of the same line of thinking. She, in her own way, started looking at, things are changing in the law. And she looked at like the historical piece of how contracts used to be before the printing press, and they were beautiful. And she showed me some, like big calligraphy and gold leaf, and like it was a major thing, like a sacred kind of connection to create a contract. And then when the printing press came along, they just, stamped them out, and, it was hard to change them. And so, it was a whole history of contracts that, it's now starting to go back. We're starting to have more of our senses to go from her frame in contracts. There are like videos, video agreements. There's a whole legal design movement that's huge, where instead of a contract looking like a bunch of tiny print on a page that's 87 pages long, and nobody's ever read it, and it's one document that a paragraph gets added that maybe contradicts a paragraph on another page, but nobody's read it, and everybody's just signing it, which happens more than I'd like to even think. And now they're doing them like in plain language where people can understand them, using design elements like comics. Like there's a whole movement of comic contracts, which are like started in both Australia and South Africa. I became aware of them in South Africa. And they were originally by Robert DeRoy. He said he wanted the people who could not read to have the dignity of being able to understand their contracts and to enter into a contract. And so they they were originally for like housekeepers and farm workers and things like that. But in Australia, they took it to an employment contract with a company with 7,000 employees, engineers. but because engineers aren't going to read all of this stuff. And so it's all very understandable. It's, just a cartoon. I might have an image of it.
It's beautiful. That's so beautiful.
And so the multi-sensory part is, like the visual now, not just the words on a paper, but the visual, the auditory. She's just recently retired, but she was really excited about all of the different ways that a contract could interconnect us.
Kim,
So that's multi-sensory. I mean, you want to pick out another one?
I'm thinking of two things. Well, that might be a segue to if you wanted to talk briefly about conscious contracts, which is, I know, a real passion of yours. And then also, I'm thinking of another slide that you have in here, the garden, that might be nice to share.
It happens to be the next slide. So when I wrote Lawyers as Changemakers, one of the things I did is I interviewed people, and I had 111 contributors who all wrote about their perception of integrative law from their many different places. And I collected what I thought were the values of the integrative law movement from that. And so those values included things like being relational, dignity, law as a spiritual path for some people, embracing challenges, compassion, making the world a better place. You can see the others. And the one that sort of rose to the top all the time was this sense of interconnectedness. And so I started thinking about it in terms of permaculture. And as we change the soil, we change what grows from the soil and what can grow and how strong it is. And this idea that it's like mycelium, like it's nourishing us and allowing different things to happen. And so the garden really represents all of these different things that are happening in the legal profession. I see this weeping willow tree or whatever it is as like the ADR movement, the alternative dispute resolution movement. They have developed a whole lot of different kinds of mediation, and they sometimes claim collaborative law and restorative justice as part of what they're doing. So there are all these different pieces. There's almost as many different kinds of mediation as there are mediators. But then things like therapeutic jurisprudence and sharing law, or there's a guy in Monterey who has the coach approach to being a lawyer, and so he has brought coaching skills into his law practice. And so all of these are representative of different kinds of creative solutions. And then the bees are people like me who travel from place to place and cross-pollinate and share information.
Oh,
So
that's
this is my favorite image right now.
That's wonderful. I didn't really notice the bees before, but there they are.
You see there's a little hive in the back as well.
Okay.
And I'll show you this one too. This is another image. So my students in my course do a lot of art. We actually have them create images for who they are. We call it the touchstone. And we have them do a contract that's completely a visual contract as part of their study. And one of my students actually became really interested in art. Her mother had been an artist, and she'd kind of gone the other direction of being a lawyer. And she integrated the art into her career and created some really amazing graphics for us. So this is a lot of the topics that we believe are part of the integrative lawyering movement. And I can actually point to a person who specializes in each one of these. So when you're thinking about what is a lawyer, right now the focus is down on the sort of the right corner, the analytical thinking, professional identity, maybe substantive legal knowledge, plain language. As we get farther and farther out, it becomes less mainstream. But all of these other things are things that lawyers are working on or could be working on if they knew more about them. And so we looked at the different kinds of knowledge, uh, and uh, and transpersonal, systemic, interpersonal, and intrapersonal, relational, I guess is what we called it. And all of these different topics are important in some areas of law.
I love the, I mean, it's in the name, and the integrative approach
It
to,
is.
acknowledge that we're all human beings and we're living in a societal system, and we need the structure and order to allow us to all live together, but to do it in a way that works for us as human beings.
Absolutely. And the challenge is figuring out how to do that in a way that's healthy.
Mm.
We're kind of now based in a system on the drama triangle, which is an unhealthy dynamic. It's like you have the victim and the persecutor or prosecutor, and you have the rescuer. It's like the plaintiff and the defendant and the judge, or all of these different things. But that's a very familiar pattern to most people.
Mhm.
Well, also, I think a lot of lawyers see themselves as a rescuer.
Mhm.
They often do become entangled in other ways too. We've seen
Exactly.
where they become a victim or they become a perpetrator, but I think fundamentally they see themselves as a rescuer, and in a positive way, that they see that. They don't see that perpetuates the triangle. But
Right.
yeah.
Right. And so I actually teach the drama triangle in my class, and it's called the TED approach to get out of the drama triangle. So
The TED approach, what is that?
the empowerment dynamic.
Yeah.
Mm. I'd love to, just in the theme of the week of forgiveness, just dive in a bit more about forgiveness and where forgiveness shows up in the integrative law, and the role that it has to play, either pre a dispute becoming a dispute, or supporting the dispute resolution process.
I think it could be in a lot of different places. Like if forgiveness happens, it doesn't necessarily resolve the issue, but it probably resolve it. When we resolve our emotional issues, we are less likely to go to trial. I mean, they found that out even in the apology world, that companies who now do that as a strategy. They apologize because they don't want to go to trial. And so the idea of forgiveness and apology are not required to be together, but beforehand that would be one place, and then that the whole process is designed to point out where you disagree.
Mm.
And it's not about bringing people together, and so then at the end they're just left destroyed, and like one has taken advantage of the other, and there's this competition for who's going to come out on top, that that leaves them unsatisfied. There's actually in procedural justice, they study that what people really want is to be treated with respect and allowed to tell their story. And that's not what the legal system does, and sometimes not even in mediation. And so the idea of having sort of the next step, which is, now that we have, gone to battle, how do we go through some kind of a forgiveness process so that we can interrupt that dynamic, that, it's not just, the battle of a court, but an actual healing. So I see that as it can, in restorative justice, it's an obvious one, but again, in those divorce cases where a lot of bad things have happened, that sense of completion and closure that forgiveness can bring can allow them to co-parent, for example. When I was doing divorce law, I always had my clients create a vision for where they wanted to be in 5 years. And they said things like, I want to dance with my daughter's father at her wedding, or I want to be able to sit in the bleachers with my ex and see, when my son makes a basket, and he doesn't have to look, for both parents, and, have that confusion, when he just can look up and see us both together. And so that, they would create things like that would require a lot of forgiveness to get there. And we use that to go through our process. Even in the cases where I was litigating, it's like, does this get you closer to that? Or, like, because people get really upset and they want to lash out. But if they're looking at that long-term vision and holding that hope that it will happen, then they're in a much stronger position to create it. And so, I mean, I could see, in my wildest dreams still, that there would actually be, part of the court system that would be focused on that kind of completion, closure, forgiveness, to be able to move on. I mean, Eileen referred to the division in the country. I think a lot of it has to do that there was never that kind of closure from the Civil War. And we're still having it.
Exactly. I wanted to come in on this piece about forgiveness. When I started, well, at some point I was asked to write a law review article for Pepperdine University, for Pepperdine Law School, and about forgiveness. And so I researched to see, well, what else is out there? Nothing is out there. There is the word forgiveness in legal, if you do legal research, it's all about debts, forgiving a loan. That's all you see. And I recently looked to see if anything had changed. No, nothing has changed. So there's one law review article that I wrote about forgiveness in legal disputes. And I mention it because, and it's on my website if anybody wants to download it, there's a way to do that. But in there, I purposely wanted, because family law, for sure, we can see the need for it. But in that article, I gave examples, probably half a dozen or more that weren't family law: probate, real estate, contracts. Anytime there is a dispute and there's discord, there's an opportunity for forgiveness. Now, it doesn't mean, people are always ready for that or want it, but I gave examples: personal injury, for sure. It's a lot, and a lot of need across the board. And so there's examples. Sometimes people forgive on the front end. They just forgive right away, and it helps sort of nip things in the bud. I've worked with now my practice has a lot of people, it seems to be, who are in the process. So I'm helping them. They're using the tools of forgiveness to prepare for mediation because they're so anxious or angry about it, to prepare for deposition, things like that. And then certainly, as you said, Kim, afterward, if they're still left with anger and resentment, it's, at some point, hopefully they're ready to say, I want to be done with this. I want to move forward. And so it doesn't always have to require even both people. In a mediation, it can. And then you're really looking more at apology as the precursor of forgiveness. But one person alone, I don't know that we've made this point yet. We certainly should. But it's something that I really learned from Fred Luskin, is that one person alone can forgive. You don't need anything from the other person to do it. That's really, I call it unilateral forgiveness. That's really important. We all have that opportunity. Now, I've heard stories, I don't know that this was directly involved me, where a lawyer told his client, don't forgive, it'll hurt your case.
Yeah.
They wanted the anger. They wanted that. That was the fuel. That's, to me, is very sad. I don't want to hear that anymore.
Well, don't get well in your personal injury case either.
Right.
And the whole thing is sort of designed not to promote healing.
It takes to take people in the opposite direction into the conflict.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, picking up on that, some of the things you were sharing before, Kim, in the business world, oftentimes it's just built into the cost of doing business. And there's nothing built in to avoid those costs. There's nothing built in to deal with the human, the emotional, the relational aspects of somebody you were doing business with. And that's just, it's not resourced, it's not staff, there's not awareness about there is an alternative to this hidden or intended cost of doing business. It just gets added as a line item on business.
Well, and you reminded me that Eileen specifically asked about conscious contracts, and it's one of the models that I co-created, and it's about having actually a conversation that in contracts we call it the meeting of the minds, where you actually talk about what's important to you. That may not be the topic of the contract, but it's like, sort of that statement of your vision, mission, and values, the principles by which you run your life and those sorts of things. And then we also include like an inquiry into how you work, like, how do you usually resolve conflict, and what are the signs that you're in stress, and what can other people do when they see you're in stress? And then how are you going to resolve conflicts together based on all of that? And we build that in as an alternative to going to litigation. And I've put forgiveness practices in those. One of my favorite stories is I had a building contractor and a developer. I was working on the contract between the two of them, and this contractor was sort of, like not what I imagined would be a guy who would really get into this, and yet he did. He sat down, his crack was showing. He's big guy with a flannel shirt and all that kind of stuff. And I asked him, what's most important to you? And he started going on about how forgiveness was like the most important thing in his life, and on and on and on and on. And so that became a real thread in our contract, and help them when they did get into the inevitable conflicts, because conflict is inevitable if you're going to be in the world. You drive down the road and you have to resolve conflicts about who's going to turn right and and left and all that kind of stuff. It's it's everywhere. It's a matter of creating a system that works for resolving it. And so having forgiveness as part of that system seems like a way to actually have things work better. If forgiveness is part of your process, then you're not carrying the weight of a lot of things that are not resolved into the future, and you have more energy to do other things. And so for businesses, it seems to me that that's a natural.
And I'd love you both to take this from the conceptual to the real practice. What does that actually look like? What does a forgiveness process look like? And could you share some experiences that you each have had where you've used forgiveness?
I had one of the ones that means the most to me is a divorce case. There were all of the bad stuff, like there was an affair. There was family money that had been lost in a business. There was somebody wanting to move away. Lots and lots of stuff. And we, to their credit, they decided they were going to do a collaborative process. And I generally could do a collaborative process with most people in 4 or 5 meetings. I think we had 12 meetings. So they did a lot of work on themselves. And so they also had a divorce coach who did a lot of the forgiveness work with them, the actual work of forgiveness. But at the end, so all of these things that could have destroyed their family, they took it on. And at the end, we came together to sign the papers. And they they said, we've worked really hard. We need to have some kind of celebration. Does anybody have like a glass of wine, or anybody got any champagne? And we were in my colleague's office, and he says, I've got 1 beer in the refrigerator. let me see if I've got a couple of glasses. And they looked at each other and said, we don't need a glass. And they took this beer and they passed it back and forth, and they spoke to each other about their appreciation. And then he kissed her on the forehead, and they hugged each other, and their marriage was over. That, like that, and then they went to lunch together. And I ran into my client several times, in social situations later, and it was still working. Like they had done all the work they needed to do in the process to go on and live their lives. And so for me, that was a great example of, a lot of the emotional work got done in that divorce. And then I'll just mention in another case with very similar facts, I was at a theater, and somebody is yelling about 6 rows up, Kim, Kim. And I look up, and I'm with somebody else. I say, oh, that's the opposing party in one of my cases. And she comes climbing over the seats and gives me a big hug. And I'm just like, yeah, that, like my life is better. Their lives are better. This is the good work.
So beautiful. So beautiful. I love those stories. And one of the things that it reminds me that's so important is that when people do this, it is done. It's done. That when that ice melts, it is never there again. That's one of the best parts of it. It's a real what's a tectonic shift. Yeah, everything changes. One that came to my mind, and there's so many, but this one was especially beautiful. And I think, listening to you, it's like, and talking to other professionals who have these moments, there's just so beautiful. And they give so much meaning to the parties, but to us too, to those of us who are privileged to support it and be part of it. And so I had this mediation come to me many years ago, and it was a probate case, and it was between two people who had been married. They had gone through a really difficult divorce, like 15 years prior. They had an adult son who, in his 20s, tragically died of a drug overdose. And now these two were entrenched in a really, really nasty probate dispute that was mostly centered on who was going to be the executor, which one of them. And all I could think of was they're still like litigating their divorce. This is like a continuation of their divorce battle. And it's just so sad to see it. But they were such bitter enemies that it really mattered to them. Their son happened to have started an internet company. He'd made a lot of money in his short life. He was, I don't remember, like 27, maybe 28 at most. And so he had a fair amount of money. And so they were really, they wanted control over that. They wanted control over, I guess he had some wonderful sports car that wasn't the value of the car, but I think the son loved that car so much. So of course they both wanted it, that kind of thing. Everything was war. And when we got together, and the thing that really made a big difference, I have to say, in this particular case was the lawyers, because I think it was the wife said to me, she said, we really need to forgive each other. They clearly did. But why I really, really appreciate the lawyers that day is that they very readily agreed to allow me to meet with the husband and the wife alone, which some lawyers will, some lawyers won't. Sometimes the lawyers want to be front and center, and that's that. These lawyers like, no, that's fine. we went into a room with the two of them, and they both started sobbing. And that we're just sobbing, I would say maybe for 15 or 20 minutes. And what they said was, we have never shared our grief. And that all of this, in addition to being a continuation of the divorce, was the grieving process. And in fact, even at the funeral, they were either on opposite sides or they weren't together. And they just shared their profound pain of this tragic loss. Their son meant everything to them. And they sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And then once they had done that, and it really was like 20 minutes, something like that, which in some ways you could say, well, that's an eternity. And in some ways, it's nothing after all these years of all this acrimony. And then we went, I don't remember, they were hugging and all of that. And then they went back in with the lawyers. And then it was just like a totally different conversation. No, you take the car. No, you take the car. They couldn't do enough. They didn't care about anything else. That was it. And that was just so, so beautiful. So beautiful. But the thing is, they were ready for it. It's not something, I think it was Ken who said the other day, there can't be any pressure around this, especially with, you can't really force somebody into an apology either, but I will coach a little bit on, is there anything you'd like to, but forgiveness, it's like, I just want to create a space and stand back and support it because it's deep, it's personal. For some people, it's very spiritual. So I don't feel like there should be any interference there. But that was really, really beautiful. And I want to kind of come back to something that was mentioned, that I mentioned earlier. Well, I want to say two things. One is that this kind of healing, forgiveness, it does. I remember giving a talk with you in San Francisco once to ABA Kim, and somebody, and was to mediators, a lot of mediators. And somebody said, well, this doesn't really fit into our structure. And that particular, year, we also were working with a systems design expert and speaking with her, and had just given a talk with her. And so I brought that into the room and I said, that's right. It requires a different structure, a different design. It sometimes takes time. You met with those people, you said many, many times in your example. Mine required stepping out of the box into having the parties meet separately, which is not unheard of, but having lawyers who supported that. We have this in commercial mediation. There's a really strong mode that people are in, which is, so we're all going to come together for one day and we're going to get it done. And if we don't get it done, we'll meet another day. But in 2 or 3 days or something, you expect it to be done. But those full days with the lawyer, that's not where it's at always. And when you have deep emotional work, I do with those kind of cases, I was like, let's start with 2 hours and then see what makes sense. And then we may, I'm working with a case now where it came to me as a mediation, and it was between family members, a case that could go to easily, it's not in litigation yet, but it was on the verge of. And what was really clear, because they were family members, is that they needed to forgive. And fortunately, I did ask them about that, if they'd be interested. They were receptive. That was back in January, and I'm still working with them individually, and we haven't come back together yet. And they both have made it clear that we're not in a rush for that. This is what's really important, is healing our family. That's, I can't force that, but they come to that. And that was the other. So I think we in the legal system, I would like to see us be creative and not rigid about the structure, so that we can open it up to allow for this to happen. And then the other piece is about, there's even a wonderful book called Power versus Force. The legal system is force, and sometimes you need it, and it's good to have it as a last resort. But what happens when you can empower people? That's what I heard in what you shared. That's what I see in these cases too. I follow their lead. Once it opens up, you tell me, what do you need? And then we
As
don't
you
need
both
worse.
as you both were speaking, I'm just reminded of the refrain, there's no time in the emotional world. And that's, I mean, that's just the nature of what it means to be human, that we need the time that we need to process the emotions, the things that are there for us. And so I'm hearing from both of you that the legal system historically has not been open to that, and there's not a framework, there's not from a systems design perspective, it's not built into the system, and there aren't enough people trained to be a resource for people going through that process.
That's
And,
exactly, yeah.
and the flip side of that is that often an event happens and, and a case gets filed, whether it's criminal or civil, and it's 5 years later that it actually gets heard. And all of that time it's churning and unresolved, and it can't be resolved because the case is pending in the court system. And so that's the other side of some people needing time. Sometimes they need some, more immediate intervention, and that's not part of the design either.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is really important. And I want to say on a more positive note, there is a court in Wichita, Kansas, that is incorporating forgiveness into its what we call alternative dispute resolution options. Mediation is one of those options. Now, when there's high conflict cases, there are judges who are sending people to somebody, an attorney who also happens to be a social worker and a graduate of my program, I'm proud to say, who they send them to her to have mediation training and coaching. So again, one out of how many thousands of courts in the country and then in the world, but it's a start. It's a step. So I always want to shine light on that. And I think that's always, Kim, you recently sent me this wonderful video about, well, what does it take to have a movement? What does it take to, so first you have the crazy leader that's just out there. And I think that's how we bonded. I felt like a crazy, one-off person. And then I met Kim, and she was one of those pioneers too in her own. And like you say, you've gone around the world finding those people and telling them they're not alone. And it means so much to all of us. And then some, other person joins them, and they have a follower, and then there's like two a little bit crazy. But the significant shift is when more people follow, when they follow the follower, and then you start seeing, well, now it's safe to join, and then people come in. So that's a lot. We've been talking about that all week in the chat. What does it take to create a movement, build a movement? Because this clearly needs to be one. I think it's in our hearts and our souls. Now I want to actualize it.
So I always say community gives us courage. And what you said, like almost every person I have found or has found me, because one of my roles in the movement is to be really visible so that people can find me and I can then connect them with everyone else. And so the people say to me, I thought I was alone. And that community gives them more courage to step out, and I'm thrilled that Wichita, Kansas is not California. It's, it's
It's not
Wichita,
San
Kansas,
Francisco.
it gives me more hope, that these kinds of things can happen. But, there are lots of these pioneers, one person in a community. This is the weirdest lawyer in town. And they're actually sort of responding to an energetic shift that's happening, that's part of this movement. And they may be the only one hearing that, or experiencing that, but they are part of something bigger. And so, I have gone to a lot of towns where there was one person. I got on a train and went to a town in Germany from the Netherlands because I knew there was one person there and that she was alone. And that's what I did for 15 years, is to go and find those people. And in the first 2 years, I interviewed a lot of them, and now we have a podcast. So I want to plug the podcast with Integrative Lawyers of the World podcast. And we have one lawyer from each continent who was doing integrative law. We've got 6 seasons. So 36 lawyers from 6 continents that we've been interviewing, and they've been sharing their pathway.
That is beautiful.
Well, as we come up to our time to wrap up the show, any closing thoughts or comments you'd like to share, Kim?
I'll pass to Eileen and then I'll see what I want to say.
Well, Kim, I just can't thank you enough for doing this. And I want to say, you know, community gives us courage, but making yourself visible takes courage. When you said that, I made myself visible so people could find me. That takes courage too.
Yeah.
And I just really bow to your spirit. That I remember when I met you, I have so many images of you with your wheel suitcase with you. There's Kim, there's with her her carry-on or whatever. And yeah, the elephant.
I have the elephant. That'll be my closing.
Okay,
Yeah, go
that's
ahead, finish
beautiful.
what you were
So
saying.
I just want to really acknowledge you from the bottom of my heart and for your courage, your vision, the way you care, the way you took a train to meet that one person in Germany, and I know you've done that all over the world. And just the service of that, of being home free, as you say, nomadic, for many, many, many years. I mean, during that time, I used to see Kim more because she would come through the Bay Area and stay with me, and we really got to know each other. And so I miss that, but the bond is there. And I just really thank you for all you've done.
It's been a real pleasure. And I want to end with the elephant, and we'll see if it can show. So this is the mascot for the Integrative Law Movement, and it comes from the story of 6 blind men encounter an elephant for the first time, and one touches the back of the elephant and says an elephant is like a wall, and one touches the ear and says an elephant is like a fan. One touches the trunk and says an elephant is like a snake, spear, rope, tree. And so the thing about the integrative law movement is there are a lot of different pieces to it. You know, you may be in forgiveness, we're talking about maybe the leg. And you know, when we talk about restorative justice, the models, we talk about the systems change, we're talking about different parts of a whole. And so I want to say that, you know, we didn't talk about everything in the integrative law movement, but we hit a lot of the topics. But, you know, if it feels like integrative law, it's got the heart of integrative law, then it probably is integrative law. So I'll wrap up with that.
Well, Kim, delightful to have you with us today, and thank you for your work. Thanks for all that you're doing in the world, and just so grateful. We couldn't have had this week without you.
Thank you very much.
It wouldn't have been integrated.
We
And
have
Eileen, do you want to kick us off, or just share with our audience what we've got in store as we wrap up this Forgiveness Week tomorrow?
Right. I don't really want it to end, but we have a wonderful, there's some wonderful people who will be joining us tomorrow, and I want to tell you about them. The first one is Olivier Clerc. I met Olivier many years ago because of a book he wrote called The Gift of Forgiveness. And at that time, I was reaching out to everybody around forgiveness, and I met Olivier. And he talks about the power of asking to be forgiven, not forgiving the other, but asking to be forgiven. And it's brilliant. And he has started something called Forgiveness Circles. And for many years he lives in France. For many years, he gave forgiveness conferences every year. Hundreds of people would come. Fred Luskin, when I heard Fred Luskin was there one year as a speaker, I said, well, I want to come. So a couple years later, he invited me. It was really, really wonderful. So I'm really looking forward to you meeting him and all of us hearing him. Our other guest tomorrow is Marina Cantacuzino. Marina is a journalism background. And many years ago, she started something called the Forgiveness Project in the UK. And what's so powerful about that is that, we've talked all week about the power of stories. Well, recognizing, and she's a journalist, this is a website where they post stories of forgiveness, people who are forgiven under extraordinary circumstances. And there are thousands of them now. So if you ever feeling low one day and you want to get inspired, go to the Forgiveness Project and read some of these stories. It'll blow you away. She's been successful. It's now being run by others. And so she's gone on to do other work. She's written many books, and she recently spent time in Rwanda at the anniversary celebration. It's interesting to say of the genocide, but what they're celebrating obviously is the healing that took place in that country, and she was there for that. And so hopefully she'll share with us about some of that, because that's certainly an extraordinary example of where forgiveness and healing has occurred. So really looking forward to both this, I guess it's our International Day. She's based in the UK and he's based in France. So looking forward to that, Tom.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for being with us today. And for those who are available, please join us in the after chat as the conversation will continue, and look forward to tomorrow's conversation as we wrap up an extraordinary week on forgiveness. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.